Last week I did a video talking about the 3 different types of tanks in Marvel Rivals, and you guys really liked that. And the week before, I did one about the DPS, and you guys really liked that. And of course, the #1 requested thing was to do it for the supports, which really intimidated me because the supports are kind of an amalgam, and everyone loosely agrees that there's just like, you know, main supports and then there's flex supports, but I've discovered a third category which makes me unbelievably happy. But let me explain how this video works in case maybe this is your first time. We're gonna go through, we're gonna talk about each of the categories of supports within Marvel Rivals, what they're good against, what they're maybe not so good against, and then we're going to talk about which each category, each character is, so that you can best understand what type of tools you generally can expect to have. Let's get into the first and the most common category, which is the lifelines. Lifelines are your core or main healers. These are your healers that pump out an unbelievable amount of healing. In fact, they are mostly defined by their ability to stack multiple healing sources. To compensate for this, they typically don't have the best damage, the lower damage overall, and they also have tools for stun or crowd control for defense, for defending themselves, being that they can't really kill things on their own. And these also tend to have mobility tools that are built around running back, like marathon type mobility, so that you can get back into the fight quicker if you end up going down. Now, this is something that we did with the tanks that we're also going to do with the supports that we were not able to do with the DPS, but I might go back and do. And in fact, as I've discovered and as I've been looking through and kind of peeling apart the game to understand the devs' intentions or the devs' designs behind all of these characters, I've realized that there's some puzzle pieces that are intentionally made to fit in with one another, which is kind of obvious, but I think it would be worth the video. So if that's something that's interesting to you, please let me know. But the ults for the lifelines are almost always universally that big source, that big circle of heal, that anti-sea bear circle of, hey, my team is going to live basically no matter what. Unless you can one-shot kill everything within this circle or whatever, we are going to live it. Even if you throw an unbelievable amount of damage, we're gonna live it. All right, cool. Moving into the next category, and these next 2 categories are both flex or like off supports or non-main healer supports. These are supports that you don't take in solo. Like, of course, any team can make something work, and you know, it's gonna be dependent on your particular skills or not, but in most cases, you need at least some character with a little bit of lifeline in your support before you start going into this other stuff. But anyway, I digress. These are the utility supports. Utility supports have inconsistent or maybe burst healing that isn't the best, but it still comes in clutch. To compensate, they have ridiculously high damage. Like, this is damage that's close to DPS levels of damage. This is really good damage, as that's their main defense. And the other type of defense that they get is damage negation abilities, basically like soft tanking, if you can think of it that way. But they don't have great mobility. In fact, they get dived really easily, and they have to basically skill shot their way out of a bad situation. Now, their ults are also interesting too, in that they don't heal directly. They aren't, you know, the big circle of I'm doing a bunch of healing, but instead they are some type of support, some type of thing that buffs the team that isn't just strictly I'm healing my friends. We'll talk more about some of the specifics here. This will make sense when we start going over the specific characters and the who's what's of whatever's going on, right? All right. This last category. This is the category that I'm most excited for, because this category I have not seen anybody talk about, but everyone I've brought it up to went, yeah, that makes sense, which is so cool. This feels like a puzzle that was left in by the devs that we found. You know what I'm saying? Like, all this discussion happened on Discord for a reason. These are playmakers. This is another flex category. Playmakers' whole thing is that they have consistent but not great healing overall, moderate damage, burst mobility or abilities that help them to get around easy, as well as easy access to movement options that aren't directly tied to some type of direct ability, and ults that open up damage options. Playmakers, like the name implies, their whole thing is to basically like be the flashbang through the door, be the first thing that sort of initiates the team to roll over everyone else. These characters are really unique because I have, well, in the 2.5 other hero shooters that I'm aware of, I don't see a lot of. The playmaker category is so unique to Marvel Rivals. There's some representation, but not like category worthy stuff. And when I start talking about the specific characters, I think you're going to agree with me. By the way, if you've made it this far, if you've been enjoying this, if you've been enjoying this series and you want to see me talk about like the different types of team compositions that these categories can lend themselves to, again, subscribe to all the other stuff. I probably already mentioned already, but I forget to do it all the time, so I'm mentioning it here. Okay, now let's go into each character and let's talk about these in alphabetical order. I'm going to start here, of course, with the A's in Adam Warlock. Adam Warlock is the perfect representation of a utility-based support, 100%. 100%. Dude has incredible burst damage. He's got damage negation abilities with his soul bond, and his mobility is garbage. He has garbage mobility, but his ult can be really cool. But it's not just direct healing. Like, he is through and through. He is the guy. When I talk about utility, that should hopefully was the thing that came to your mind. Hopefully he was the first thing that came to your mind, all right? Next is Cloak and Dagger. Now, Cloak and Dagger does a really good job of demonstrating why I think a lot of people had a hard time, or were kind of, well, it was partially at least my hesitation when we were categorizing these supports, in that the supports in Cloak and Dagger operate differently than how, like, say, the DPSs, the tanks do. Like, the DPSs and the tanks, the way that they are categorized is sort of like a blend of colors. And what I mean by that is, like for example, Brawl and Dive have some pretty significant overlaps in terms of how they mechanically engage. It's just a matter of like what the rest of the kit really supports. Whereas with the different categories of supports specifically, it's more about borrowing tools from these different categories as opposed to like a blend of a particular playstyle that tends to lean more one way or tends to lean the other way. And Cloak and Dagger is the absolute excellent example of this. Arguably, Cloak and Dagger can fit into all three categories. They have tools that borrow from each of them, even if in a small bit. So I could argue one of the few times we see a 33, 33, 33 type support. I've seen other people argue that they're more of a lifeline first, and then the other stuff is maybe like 10 to 20% secondary. Hash it out in the comments. Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts with it. But yeah, I think that she does a good job of demonstrating my point. Yeah. All right, moving into Invisible Woman. Invisible Woman is half lifeline, half utility, 50-50. She has pretty good healing with that shield, and it's a shield, which means she can damage negate, and she has some good crowd control tools as well. Some people made argument when we were discussing this over our Twitch chat that maybe Invisible Woman is a little bit of a playmaker because she has like more access to damage tools and she's got the jump to get out of danger, but I think that it's too small of a thing. But again, let me know in the comments. Take all this with a grain of salt. Moving into Jeff. Jeff is a playmaker, lifeline, 80-20. Most of his healing is fine. He can do a little bit of healing stacking, but that's not the best way to use him. He's got great mobility, and his ult is arguably one of the most unique ults in the game, and that ult opens up damage options, if not just dealing damage effectively itself. Jeff is a bit of a split between that, and I think that's partially why he's weak right now, is because if you're not fully committing to that playmaker lifestyle, lifeline is just too small for him to make up the rest of it. Next up is Loki, who is 100% a playmaker. This dude, if there were 3 supports and Loki was one of those supports, he basically becomes like a soft DPS at that point because the support category is so well covered. This dude's best option is to grab a DPS ult and pop it down, or to copy another lifeline. His whole thing is opening up damage, which I think is perfect as a representation of Loki being the purest of playmakers. And hopefully by that same metric, you understand that Luna is 100% a lifeline character. Like, she is the purest example of, I want to do a lot of healing over a lot of period of time. I have a stun to protect myself, and my ult turns off damage for a while. Luna, 100% lifeline. I hope there's no argument on that. Moving into Mantis, who's mostly a utility with a little bit of lifeline inner, so I would argue about 80-20, maybe 50-50, but, you know, her damage is such that she gets a lot of her value out of that damage rather than out of the healing itself. Like, it's kind of hard to solo heal with Mantis, so again, I argue 80-20 utility lifeline. Next up is Rocket, who is one of the only characters, if not the only character, that has, I would argue, a multi-class that doesn't multi-class at least a little bit into lifeline. In fact, I think the reason why all of these characters are mostly lifeline is because the game needs them. Like, you need lifelines. If you don't have that many supports, most of them need to be lifelines. So I think that's partially why the categories are so hard to distinguish, but Rocket's one of the few that I think that does not sit at all in the lifeline category, but instead sits firmly in the playmaker utility category. Maybe 80-20, maybe 50-50. I decided to go 80-20 with this because his healing is fine, but it's not good enough to be a solo healer. It's just too inconsistent, it's too slow, but he's got great mobility options, all right damage, and again, ults that open up damage options for his team. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, I want to talk about how you can use this knowledge, how you can best take advantage of this knowledge. So first and foremost, like I mentioned, you absolutely need to have some lifeline on your team. I would argue you need to have at least like 80% of your supports like combined total made up with lifeline. There needs to be like one character with about 50 and one character with about 20-ish if you're going to have a shot. Obviously, that's going to change between the teams, but generally speaking, that's the best place to go, right? But besides that, the supports counters and such are a little bit different, because whereas the tanks and the DPSs are really heavily engaging with the first-person or third-person shooter mechanics, the shooter mechanics of the game, the supports are more playing chess. In fact, I would argue they're more playing like a card game, like Magic the Gathering, Hearthstone, Yu-Gi-Oh, whatever, right? They're choosing options that best suit what is available to them and what does the best to, in the broad sense, push back against the enemy team. So it's not going to be like the strict counters like a flanker is good against a poker. Instead, it's going to be this broad strategy is somewhat good at slowing down, stopping, or negating the value of this other strategy. I hope I'm making sense, right? Like the counters are even softer here than they were in some of the other videos. But that still doesn't mean that you can't play around them or to their strengths. So for example, lifelines really like sustained fights. So characters that want to basically hold space for a really long time, anchor tanks in particular, like you saw from the tank video, are one of their favorites. And then playmakers are really good in supporting dive or flank type stuff, because it's basically an all-in damage strategy. They can't heal if they're dead. It's the basic 4-1-1 of playing around this. And then of course the utility is good with brawl, things that like to basically, like a wave, just wash over a space and wipe them all out and continue to keep the fight going. That's going to be the place that utility has the most value. And in general, this one, again, take with a massive grain of salt. I would say that lifelines are soft countered by playmakers, playmakers soft countered by utility, utility against lifeliner, or utilities countered by lifelines. Reasoning for each of these, again, asterisks on all of these. Lifelines, their best thing is to just turn off damage for a little while with their ults. Playmakers' whole thing is to just basically say no to that. Playmakers don't have the greatest of healing overall, which that burst healing that the utility can offer is a great way to shut that down. And then utilities don't have the greatest healing long term, even though they can get a lot of healing in the short term, and the lifelines can exploit this and just choke them out, basically just win through a war of attrition. So playing into the strengths and weaknesses of this can help you get a vague understanding. Again, all of this just take with a massive grain of salt. I'm trying to make sure that you all don't take this as gospel, but just general good guidelines and good strategies and things that I found success with. Lastly, I want to talk about Storm. If you are looking to get into support, Storm is your best friend. Storm plays sort of like a support, and she supports her team pretty heavily, but it's not support directly. So if you're a DPS player like myself and you want to start learning how to play supports but you don't want to throw, pick up Storm. She's like a pure playmaker, and it'll give you some good ideas as to how to position and when to time your stuff. It'll work brilliantly for you. Okay, what do you guys think? This is all of them. This is all the tanks, the DPSs, and the supports, and I think they're pretty good. We had a lot of discussion about one of the things that happened in the tanks, and I agree with. You guys can go check that out. Do you guys want me to talk more about like team comps and stuff? Let me know. If you guys are also interested in getting some training from us, join us on Patreon. We have means of doing that there for you. But of course, subscribe, like, all of that means a lot to us already. Thank you guys so much for the massive support on these videos. Bless your faces, and deuces.